Welcome to the MAM Journals. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about the BSA Gold Star. And before I sort of go any further, I would like to express my thanks to King's Two Wheel Centre for allowing me to ride the bike and to enjoy several days on it. I think it's a great credit to them that, one, they're so kind to let me do that, but secondly, the fact that they actually quite like the idea of me going out gently and running the bike in before their main customers get a go. I think it just indicates how conscientious they are about getting these things right. So thanks again to them. I'm going to cover 6 things today. I think if we're going to do a documentary or a bikeomentary on a retrospective bike, then obviously it's important that we cover some brief historical relevance as to what it's actually a retrospective of. I'm then going to do a technical walk around the bike, go through the specifications and the equipment levels. I then want to talk about, because I think it's really relevant with these types of bikes, the quality of the finishes and the styling, aesthetic touches that they put on the bike. Then I'm going to talk about riding it. I've done 160 miles on it so far, and I think I've got a pretty good feeling for it's certainly my initial reactions to riding the bike. I think it's a bike that we should talk about sort of its history so far as it's come back into the market. Launching and reviving a brand is a challenging process, and I think I want to walk towards some conversations about how that's gone and what the issues and challenges are as you launch a new bike into the market. And finally, I'll be coming to some sort of conclusions as to what my initial views are on this, the Gold Star. I do hope that you enjoy the video. BSA was actually at one point in the 50s, the largest manufacturer of motorcycles in the world. But its history goes back much further than that. I think the company was originally founded in 1861, and it was a gun company in Birmingham, hence the BSA. It was the Birmingham Small Arms Company. They actually developed over decades and became, I guess, what nowadays would be called a consolidator and a conglomerate, manufacturing various products either based for wartime use, including weapons and vehicles, but also in peacetime, buses and various other vehicles that they were involved in the manufacturing of. They claim, and interestingly, on the tank it says 1903, and that was when they created the motorcycle company. But in fairness, they were a bit later to the market and to the party than that. I mean, certainly they were pipped to the post by Royal Enfield, India and Harley Davidson. They didn't actually make their first bike until 1910. But certainly a bike company with a lot of history and heritage. The bike that this is modelling itself on, or a retrospective of, is the Gold Star. And the Gold Star came out late 1930s, 36, 37. And I think, and the bike evolved from there. I think it was originally called an Empire, but it won some sort of trials award, got a gold award, and then the Gold Star name began to emerge. But the Gold Star as such was in production probably until 1963. Now, most riders nowadays weren't actually riding bikes in 1963, and indeed they won't have that direct relevance and link. I was around, but I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and frankly it was a pretty small grasshopper. So I've got no experience of the original BSAs, but that doesn't stop me finding these bikes appealing as part of the eclectic taste in motorcycles that I've acquired over the years. My understanding of the Gold Star, and I'm not claiming to be an expert in it, is that it really got going with what they call the iron engine on sort of 1949 onwards, when the volumes really started to come out, and they built various versions and sort of styles of bike, but it was quite a performance bike. It was quite a light bike in some of its formats and trims, sort of 380 pounds dry. When you compare that to the 470 wet of this bike, it gives you some idea of the differentials. And although it didn't produce that much horsepower, some of them were capable of 110 miles an hour. So they weren't slouches when you consider the brakes and the tyre technology that was available at that time. In terms of its dimensions, It's interesting to see how close it actually is. This idea of this is a 56-inch wheelbase, which is actually what the original Gold Star was in some of its variants, and this low seat, well, compared low by modern standards, was actually quite sort of common, a shape and style of bike at that time. And indeed the Japanese, when they first came to the market, the bikes were like this. To ride this bike, it sort of reminded me of I'm probably swearing in church, but with apologies, something like an RD 400 in terms of its riding position and height in relation to the floor. So an interesting bike with a great history. Right, so let's go a technical walk around and talk about the specifications of the bike. I always like to start at the engine. This is a liquid cooled, it's a single cylinder, it's a double overhead cam, it's got 4 valves and twin spark plugs. It's 652cc, compression ratio is 11.5 to 1. It produces 55 newton meters of torque at 4,000 revs. That's actually slightly more than I dynoed a Interceptor 650 on, and that produces it from memory at about 1,000 more. It produces 45 brake horsepower, which is slightly less than the Royal Enfield, and actually it produces the 45 at 6.5, while again I'm going from memory from a dyno test that I did on a standard Interceptor, and I think they produced 47-ish, but at 6,000 revs. So it produces its torque earlier than but its power later than the Interceptor, because I know a lot of you will be thinking and comparing the two. One of the first things sort of to say, and it's obvious, this, unlike the Interceptor, which has got an oil cooler on the front, this is liquid cooled, so it has the radiator. Some people don't like the aesthetics of this, but I'll be honest, I noticed it very conspicuously when I first saw it at the NEC show when I launched it, but I'm less aware of it now. The more that I spend time with the bike, the more it doesn't bother me. But again, that's an aesthetic consideration, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We're all different. In terms of suspension on the bike, it's fitted with 41 telescopic front forks, and at the rear it's got twin adjustable standard units. It's with a 5-step adjustable preload. There's no compression or rebound adjustment on either the front or the back. The brakes on the bike, it's got a single 320 floating disc at the front there. That's a Brembo twin piston floating caliper. It's nothing fancy about it, although it's a good brand. It's one of their base units, and it's got a single 255mm disc on the other side, and at the back it's linked integrated ABS. Somebody once asked me who didn't know anything about bikes, said, well, what does that mean? I said, well, they both panic together, really. It's the best way to think about it. But when I rode the bike, I found the bikes were fine, to be honest. There was no issues with them, nice feel to them, and very predictable. The wheels and tyres, they've got 18-inch front wheel and a 17-inch rear wheel. The front is 190/18, and the rear is a 50/70 R17 Pirelli, and actually that wider tyre, it did give a nice feel when I rode it. I actually quite like that combination, and they've got 36 wire spoke alloy rims, which cleaned up quite nicely considering the state they were in a few hours ago. The fuel tank is actually 12 litres, which again, I am operating from memory. We're trying to get this out as quickly as possible because I know people are eagerly awaiting it. It's a 12 litre tank, and the Royal Enfield is 15. So I guess you're going to have fairly limited range. I didn't have time to sort of calculate what the miles per gallon is doing, but I suspect it's 70-ish, something like that would be my guess. In terms of weight, it's actually very similar weight to the Royal Enfield. It's 213 kilograms, which in old money is about 470 pounds. And in terms of dimensions, it's quite a low seat height, 780, and 56 inches on the wheelbase. So a very traditional sort of feel and look to it. It's got a 26.5 degree rake on the front forks. So let's make a few comments about the styling, the quality of the build and the finish. Certainly the designers, they put a great deal of time and effort in trying to pick up this original Gold Star idea, and there's numerous sort of nuanced and more obvious style tributes to it. And if you start at the front there with that mudguard, the size and scale of the mudguard with the struts on the side is very BSA and captures that image nicely. The shape and style of the front headlamp, again, is very retrospective. The dials themselves being, as some people like to say, the wrong way round, but as I touch on when I get to riding, perfectly easy to read. The shrouds on the front forks there are very much in keeping. The single pea shooter style exhaust, when they came out and launched, actually, I seem to remember they had a shroud sort of more up here as well, which I didn't like, but correct me if I'm wrong, I won't be offended. But I think they've done that nicely. And I did actually think about cleaning. I've washed this, but I haven't polished it. So you can see how bronzed it has got quite quickly. This has only done 160 miles, but I think it's probably good that if you're thinking about buying one of these, you understand these exhausts are going to bronze pretty quickly. And if it bothers you, then you need to think about that. Personally, it doesn't bother me, and I'm sure they'll clean up. And each of us have our own level of appetite for how clean we keep bikes. The engine itself is, as I say, it's very nicely proportioned, with plenty of air either side of it, which is in keeping with a retrospective old British style bike. And they've kept this, which used to be the old Magneto style covering and case, which is a style feature of the BSAs. And they haven't put the ECU in here, which sometimes they do. The ECU's up under there. The engine's actually what was built by Rotax, and some people say, "Oh, well, I wish the BSA had built their own engine." And I'm not sure that in your first entry market, having the courage to build your own engine straight from scratch would be a sound move. I mean, Rotax have got been established since 1920. They do know how to build engines, and some of them have been better than others, of course. But they've done good work with KTM, Aprilia. Perhaps less popular was the work they did with BMW on their 650. But they know how to build narrow, small, light engines. And it's actually got what's known as a dry sump. So there's an oil tank under, and the oil under the panel, and the oil runs in the tubes and then is pumped into the engine. So that helps keep the dimensions and scale to it in terms of that style. Obviously the tank style itself is very reflective of the original, and as indeed are the side panels. Again, little touches which I just think, take my credit, I'll give them credit for really, because that attention to detail. This here is a very characteristic feature of a original Gold Star. They look like that. And I quite like the fact, some people have already been criticised, the indicators are too small. The original, of course, Gold Stars didn't have indicators. You used to do traditional arm waving, but if you try that nowadays, you will end up confusing members of the public and probably get yourself run over. But I actually like the fact that these are nice and small. I took my big indicators off my Interceptor virtually straight away because I felt that it somehow detracted from the traditional look. So I like that solution. It won't be everybody's taste, but again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So personally, I think they've done a nice job on the styling, and I think it's managed to capture that old feeling whilst being a modern, serviceable good handling bike in comparison for others of its type and range, and aesthetically I think it's pleasing. It's got good brakes and rides and starts nicely. Now the finish on the engine isn't to everybody's liking. I quite like the sort of the visuals of it. I think I might prefer the crankcase covers on the Royal Enfield, the Interceptor, but I've got to tell you, they take a lot of work to try and keep them sort of bright and shiny. But again, I think that's personal preference. I think these are stickers, which I'm not entirely convinced about quite how much they'll bear up under the style. And of course, the originals were more like sort of engraved or built into the casting to give those sort of emblems on it. So perhaps not one of the better features of it, but at a glance it looks okay. Overall, as I say, I think they've done a nice job with the styling and finishing. But, you know, there's some very obvious welding marks on it, but it's not rough. It's quite a nice finish and quite a nice feel. So what was it like to ride the bike? Well, I think I should start off by saying it was a pretty cold couple of days when I was riding. I think we reached a magnificent 5 degrees, but at one point it got down to 2. So pretty greasy roads. I'm on a new bike that I'm running on brand new tyres, so it was a little bit tentative at first, but I have to say my initial impression on riding it was it did feel really secure. I'm sometimes not a fan of OE supplied tyres, but I found with both this and the Royal Enfield, I've actually got a Royal Enfield, with these Pirellis on them, I found it actually, it did inspire a bit of confidence, and I never at any point had any worries in terms of it letting go, although I was obviously riding cautiously and sensibly. The other things I would say about the bike is obviously the engine. It felt smooth, very even on the throttle, no snatch at all, and it felt like it really wanted to go. The running in guidance on the in the manual is not very prescriptive. It's sort of based on common sense, which I quite liked really. It was saying obviously don't give it full throttle, don't labour the engine, and don't accelerate excessively through all the gears. So I was riding it moderately, but the way the power characteristics of this bike come through, it was very easy and rideable. In terms of the suspension on the bike, I actually found I've run in quite a few Royal Enfields, and a brand I do like, so I'll be very open about that. And I actually thought the suspension was possibly slightly more refined than the Royal Enfield Interceptor in standard form. I've actually changed the suspension on my bike, but as I say, trying to remember what it was like first, I felt it was less soft and I'd say very capable. I don't want to project it as being anything overly sporty. I do ride a lot of bikes, and it's my comments are in relation to what I'd expect a bike like this to handle. I did ride over some undulations and the speed calming marks on a road as you come to a roundabout, and I sensed it. You could probably get this unsettled if you tried, and you wouldn't have to try particularly hard to do it because it is a basic unit, but as a basic suspension units, I think they performed well. The gearbox on a new bike can sometimes be a bit notchy and a bit tight, but I have to say I had no trouble at all with a 5-speed gearbox on this. It was very easy to change up and down the gearbox. It was not notchy at all. I didn't miss a single gear, which isn't always the case when I ride brand new bikes and they're tight and running in, and I had no trouble at all finding neutral. I thought it was a nice gearbox. The instrumentation, it's got this sort of reverse clocks on it, which some people somebody said to me, well, I couldn't ride that like that. Actually, it's fine. Once you get on the bike, your brain instantly adjusts and you're intuitively reading exactly what it is in terms of revs and speed when you're going it. I found it nice and clear on the instrumentation. I found the switch gear easy to use, nice and precise, despite the fact it was pretty cold and I didn't have much feeling in my hands, which is always a good test. The bike started on the button every single occasion. There's no overrun or anything like that, or anything you can sometimes get as new models come out. Indicators nice and clear and easy. So overall, I've got to say I found it a very pleasant, nice and easy and comfortable bike to ride. I was pleasantly surprised. I think perhaps unconsciously I'd begun to have a few negative thoughts about that with the delays in the arrival of these bikes, and was sort of getting on and thinking, well, I hope this bike rides right, because after the delay there'll be trouble if it doesn't. But having got off it, I've done 160 miles now. I think it's a very suitable bike for the sort of price range and the market that it's aiming at. I said in my introduction, I'll talk about the sort of challenges of bringing a new bike back to the market, and one of my speciality subjects, I'm not particularly proud of it, but it is facetious remarks. And when I went round the Norton stand, I slightly unkindly said at the NEC show that it had more comebacks than Lazarus. And it's sort of many a true word said in jest. Launching a new brand or resurrecting a brand is notoriously difficult. If you think riding bikes is difficult or risky, you should try launching a new brand and see how you get on. It's a story that is littered with phoenix-like revivals that vanish back into the ashes as quickly as they arose. Now, in order to be successful, in my experience in launching bikes into the market, well, you need a few things. And firstly, you need a market for the type of bike that you're actually trying to sell. And there is a market for retro bikes, and it seems to be going well. But whether or not it's towards its peak or approaching its peak or past its peak, only time will tell, because it depends on what buying public think about these sort of bikes. You also need, when you launch, you need a bike that's fit for purpose. You need a manufacturer or somebody involved in it that's actually got the resources to fulfill a project like this, which isn't always as easy as it might appear. You need a distributor and a distribution network for both parts and for the bikes themselves that knows what they're doing and can work their way through the challenges of all of the legislation and various things that need to go on. And you need a sensible dealer network. So as I've touched on, let's go back to the market. I mean, you do need a market for bikes. I think there probably is a sustainable market in bikes of lower performance but charismatic and full of character, because legislation in the UK in terms of speeding and performance is gradually going to make high performance bikes and big four cylinders more and more difficult to actually place into the market. So I suspect that these smaller singles and twins are going to be the way forward for motorcyclists. Now, there has been a bit of negativity with this particular launch, because they launched it, and I suspect, like many, I went to the NEC show, not this year but the year before, and went on to the big BSA stand and was sort of quite taken by the size of their arrival to the market. But it's been troubled by significant delays, and they were hoping the bike was going to be out in the spring last year, and of course it's only just arrived now. And that level of delay does create negativity, particularly on social media nowadays. There's an expression that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but clearly that was thought up by somebody who's not met a 50-year-old motorcyclist who hasn't managed to get the bike that he was looking for, because some of it has been pretty vitriolic, but the bike is here now. And I think there is an element of, quite a large element of goodwill, and I'll touch on that in my closing comments as to why I think that. It's entering the market at a time when the economy is not what it was when they first announced they were returning back, and that may well have some impact on the sort of people that have £6,500 free cash to buy a leisure item, because I can't imagine many people are thinking about buying these as a commuter, although it's probably perfectly capable of doing that. I suspect most of its potential purchasers will be high days and holidays sort of riders with the odd longer tour put in for people who have liked to do that sort of thing on a classic looking motorcycle. So I think the UK economy may make it a little bit more difficult than it was, but clearly the most important thing when you're launching a bike is how good is the bike, and that's what I touched on. It's a very capable mid-weight, mid-power, 100-mile-an-hour bike. So fingers crossed there'll be a good demand for it and plenty of interest in a bike of this type. In terms of pricing, it's sort of slightly above the Royal Enfield Interceptor, which would probably be considered by most to be its natural competitor, and slightly below the price of the entry into the Triumph Classic range. So it's not the cheapest bike in the market, but nor is it the most expensive. So a lot of it will probably come down to personal preference and choice as to how you like your bikes to look and how you like them to ride. I said that you also needed a well-funded manufacturer in order to be successful. Certainly Mahindra is a well-established Indian conglomerate. They have got the wealth, but they shouldn't be mistaken for badly misunderstood philanthropists. They'll be launching this, and if it's a success, they have the resources to throw more resources and allocate more money into the brand. If it isn't a success, I suspect they'll do as they've done with a few of the other projects which they've embarked on. They'll let it quietly drift away and they'll invest in another project. So I think they have got, well, I know they've got the resources to do it, but I think the ultimate success will be on how much the market takes to their opening offer. In terms of distribution, they appear to have thought through carefully. They've appointed a good company in the UK, from what I can see, an established motorcycle familiar company that understands bikes, understands the market, and has the resources to do UK distribution. So that's an encouraging sign. They've also, in Europe, they've actually appointed the Peugeot group, I think, reading some of the articles that are out there. So they've gone for a slightly different arrangement in Europe than they have in the UK. And they've also selected, looking through the 20 dealers, they've got some good dealers, which is obviously, as I say, all critical in part of supporting a new brand when it comes to the market. My experience, bikes are very rarely perfect straight out the box, and there will be one or two issues on the bike, and as long as there's not significant, and when the issues arise, they've got a dealer network and a distributor who deals with it promptly, fairly, and openly. Then you can normally work your way through those sorts of challenges. I was interested to see that they've appointed Fowlers on the parts side, which is, again, another good thing from my perspective, because I have dealt with Fowlers over the years on looking for parts. And when you're dealing with somebody in parts, what you'd like to know is, does the person you don't actually have any idea what you're talking about? And they always have when I've rung Fowlers. And can they get hold of the parts and deliver them safely and securely? So for me, their choice of Fowlers is, again, an encouraging sign and a tick in the box. Other little things that encouraged me when I was looking at it was, one of the things that I do is I read the handbook, and some handbooks, just by opening them up, they can get me going quicker than a BBC news bulletin, because they just don't put any effort into it or any time in thinking about who's actually going to be reading it and what they're going to be doing with it. I was impressed with the detail and the attention to getting it right that they put into the handbook, which is, again, a good sign that they're thinking it through and they want to do a good job in the UK market, rather than just be a bit of an afterthought. We'll translate the manual from Chinese and just let them work it out from there. So again, some encouraging and positive signs that they're serious about getting this market sorted and served by this bike. So to conclude, how do I think it's going to do? Well, if people like the bike as much as I have when I've ridden it, I think it'll be a success, supported by the manufacturer, the distribution, and the dealer network. I think it's a nice bike, it rides well, and I think there probably will be a market for bikes of this type and character. And I think there is, although there has been some negativity on the social networks, When we went out and did the film, we did some filming and some camera shots at Broadway, because it nice traditional English village, and we thought it would be in keeping. And I was quite struck by how many people came up to us and were taking an interest in the bike. There's clearly a lot of goodwill, and there's various generations in there. There are people in their 70s reminiscing on their own experiences of the original Gold Star, but there are also people in their 50s and 60s who openly said they'd never ridden one, but they liked the look of it, and were asking what it was like to ride and whether it was fun, and all the sort of things that motorcyclists ask one another. It did generate interest, and whatever generation it was, it also generated quite a bit of enthusiasm and goodwill. There wasn't, I don't think there was one of them that didn't say to me, it's great to see the BSA brand out and about again. And I agree. I wish them well. Anyway, I do hope that you found this brief initial review helpful and insightful. And if you did, perhaps you might be kind enough to press like, or even if you enjoy taking information in this way, consider subscribing to the channel. I would like to, before I finally close, just say thank you again to King's Two Wheel Centre for letting me borrow the bike. It is exceptionally generous of them to do so. And as always, whether you subscribe, like or otherwise, ride safe, stay well.